cinematographer Justin Black, who shot my film Brotherly, which is currently in competition for the Canadian Oscars. And I would say one of the most sought after DPs in the country. When the camera team found out you were shooting this, they were pumped because they were following you on Instagram. And that was kind of wild to me. You've also done some huge shows like Revival, which is on Crave, based on a graphic novel shot in New Brunswick, I think. And what was the other big show? Oh, Hardy Boys. You've done Hardy Boys. So you're coming up. You're up.
Thanks.
How would you introduce yourself?
Less superlative, but I'm a DP in Toronto. Been shooting a lot of TV and some feature films. Yeah, done a few short films with Gavin, a bunch of short films in general. But yeah, narrative is mostly the space I've been in.
And you do commercial work. You do really high-end stuff. Why do you still do short films?
I started by doing a lot of short films. I think I'm up to like 30 something at this point. These days I'm more selective. I'll only do a short if it's like there's got to be a good reason, and usually it's that I really want to work with a certain person. And so like in this one, it was because like I want to keep working with Gavin. It's an investment in doing this thing with him, and also just in anything else he may come. I just want to spend time working with these people. So that's usually the main reason.
I remember being pretty pumped when you read the script and you said you were drawn to it or touched by it or had personal reasons for coming to it. I think that the film touches on pretty serious issues of mental health. It's a leading question, but how important are scripts to you?
The script is everything. I mean, sometimes a script will need a little more explanation from the director and what their intent is. I mean, there are times when I've read things and been like, this could be good or it could not be good, and it'll entirely depend on how they execute it, because it's just like a script can only be a blueprint. Sometimes I'll read scripts particularly for, like a script tells you what the film is. It's like, is this a genre or a space I want to work in? Is it interesting? Is it unexpected? Have I seen this before? That kind of thing. And this one was enticing to a cinematographer for a lot of reasons, and that it's very emotional. It's very interior. It's about lived experience. It's very poetic visually. It's impressionistic. It's non-literal, it's non-linear. So these are all things that like are, there's always a satisfaction in finding the language or the look for a given film. And sometimes that's very literal and minimal. And so it's whatever it is, just doing a film justice is inherently satisfying, but doing the things that lean into visual poetry or, just that have their own innate draw.
Great segue. Let's do this Vanity Fair style breakdown of the cinematography of Brotherly. I think what we tried to capture is how overwhelming the sensorial memory can be. And basically the present timeline is shot essentially 4:3. And then the flashbacks are widescreen. Why don't you tell us more about those two timelines from your perspective?
Yeah, so there are the two timelines for the film, which are essentially the present and the past, or reality and his memory. In this one, the character is in a state, as I understood it, and correct me because it's been a little while since we've shot it, but as we develop the visuals, the character in the present is in this state of sort of all-consuming grief by the situation that's been presented to him. And so in that sort of mindset, the world around him closes in and feels unreal because he's in this circumstance in which his brother is unconscious in front of him, but it feels like even that doesn't necessarily feel real. Time sort of floats around him. And so that sort of, I guess, informed the decision to make the hospital sort of a liminal space, an unreal space. I think, what was it? Dogville was one was it Dogville or Dogtown? Which is the one?
It was Dogville by Lars von Trier, and Cette Maison by Miriam Charles also had some like surrealistic interpretations, like black box theater, to kind of represent the, like, that's the reality timeline, but we did try to shoot it as like a panic attack with like a sense of claustrophobia that is, like you're saying, kind of surrealistic.
Yeah. So that I guess the biggest thing visually is the set design that gives it that feeling. And then the past, by comparison, is it's in real spaces, it's daytime, it's more immersive. There's just a lot of factors that make the present feel claustrophobic and soft and unreal, and the past feel more vivid. So one of the things that we broke them up with was aspect ratios. When I was rewatching the film, I actually didn't even really notice that we did that, because I think that which I'm glad for, because it changing in aspect ratios can draw your attention in good or bad ways, and when you don't notice it, that's generally good, I think. But there's just so much black in the frame that it doesn't stick out. It just contributes to this sense of like there are only certain things existing here, everything else just doesn't exist. But then there were other things with the visual texture that we did with the lighting. Obviously, the present is very selective. It's kind of barely there. The only thing you can really see clearly is his brother on the bed. Just the softness of the image. It's more diffuse. The past is sharper. It has finer grain. It's warmer. So these are just the things that we, because the character, when you're in that sort of state of grief, the memory of, or the thing that is affecting you, the trauma that's affecting you, can feel more real than what's in front of you.
Originally, I'd hoped to shoot it on film, and I think the brief that I gave you was like the present should feel like 16 mil, and the being overwhelmed by rumination should feel like 35, and like a heightened reality in that sense. Ultimately, we decided to invest the $60,000 grant from Canada Council in the Arts in paying the team equitably rather than my egotistical yearning for film. But you did a great job in the color with Outpost MTL and Martin Gauthier to achieve, I think, what we call big boy grain in the hospital and a more subtle 35 mil grain. Can you speak a little bit to grain and halation?
Yeah. When we shot it, we gave it a base layer of grain just by how we rated the camera. We shot an Alexa Mini, and we
baked it in so that we couldn't go back on it.
Yeah. The present stuff, we cranked it to 1600, which on that camera is present. And then in the past, we shot, I think we rated it more normally, and then we sort of knew and anticipated the grain going in, and then just ensured that we used good tools for the grain and halation simulation in post, which is the halation is the film style halation, the way that the red channel breaks up near clipped highlights, and also we shot within camera lens diffusion, different filters for the present and past. I'd have to check which ones we shot, but then that was further we added to that in post.
There's always a negotiation between budget and tech and equipment, and I remember there being a conversation about like trying to figure out if it would, like, the cost benefit analysis of whether we kept the camera on a dolly in the studio or if we went with a Ronin, and figuring out how the cost would turn into time saved on set, not having to break down a Ronin every time we switch lenses and recalibrate. Can you speak to any of that, either artistically or even practically, like how you enter into those conversations between like the director wants this, we need to achieve this by this. Yes, we can cut costs here, but it could cost time here. Like, how do you have those conversations between the art and the execution?
Yeah, remind me. We shot, if I recall, we didn't get a dolly. It was Ronin, and then we had a Dana dolly for certain push-ins, and then I believe that we so that we could stay on the Ronin, we would put the Ronin on the Dana dolly for when we needed a very controlled push. So it was Ronin essentially all the time, wasn't it?
Pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it might have been, like you said, on the Dana dolly for some of the over the shoulders.
Or in support for static. Yeah, it's just about figuring out how the camera needs to move, and then how much time you have to make it move in that way, and just thinking about that holistically within the whole pace of like how many shots we need to shoot in a day. And we got pretty in depth with the shot list on this one, which is great. Like we took the time to really to know the volume of what we needed to do in each location and each place. So we were able to sort of assess how quickly we needed to shoot from that point. And it's really just about priorities. I mean, if you're on like a huge budget, you might have different cameras pre-built for different supports. So you can just bring in, like if it's a Steadicam shot or a Technocrane shot and you have all the money in the world, those things just wheel in and they happen quickly. and you have the teams to support it and the money to have those things. But most of the time on lower budgets, you don't have those luxuries to go from one support. Even if you can afford the dolly, if you're going between different builds, you have to factor the time. And so for us, it was really just a matter of deciding that the motion of the handheld Ronin was important for the way we wanted to shoot certain scenes and just like freely moving and flowing. And for things that required lock-offs or slow pushes or whatever, we could put the Ronin just on the supports, and that worked well for what we were trying to do. So just about finding the thing that fits for what you want to do and how much time and money you have.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is both a joy to explore with collaborators, but it takes time. I've enjoyed always the way that we, I guess what I call mind meld.
Mm-hmm.
For me, such a huge part of the process of adapting the script to screen is just shooting each other clips. And whether it's you and saying like, oh, check out this clip from Moonlight, or The Iron Claw was a reference. I think we just had a lot of conversations about like being moved by the film After Sun, and me communicating my personal experience with my brother, and how After Sun was the film that most closely communicated that feeling I hold. But I think then it's always tricky to say, like, watch this film. That's how I feel, but it's not necessarily how I'm suggesting we shoot it. So in terms of actually executing, we talked a lot about Wendy for like the warm, beachy stuff that had like a childhood nostalgia. We talked about I Know This Much Is True, which is a relationship about brothers dealing with mental health crisis for the hospital stuff. What references do you remember us chatting through particularly that helped you say like, okay, I think this is what he's going for?
Yeah, you would put together a fairly in-depth list of clips and from different films to show different facets of the film, ranging from just how a scene was shot to the way that the thing felt, which was great because that helped me understand just how you wanted to put together this film visually, because it is very visual. The things on the page are often quite minimal, and the way that you depict those is not necessarily just something you're going to intuit from reading it. So having that way of just that visual shorthand was very useful. I guess another one outside of the ones you mentioned was Rice Boy Sleeps.
Well, yeah.
Came up. We shot by Chris Liu. I should know the director.
Anthony Shim.
Yeah, right. And we love the way that they shot it, which is wider lenses on the Ronin moving within scenes. And so just we didn't shoot everything that way, but certain scenes that was indicative of the way that we wanted to shoot. It's useful to have those reference points. So it was mostly a process for me of just understanding the references you were putting out so that I could then, like, I knew your guideposts for each scene, and that I could then engage with you in breaking it down and offering suggestions from a place of understanding with the baseline you were giving. So it was, I interpreted your references. We kind of talked and developed. From my side, the references were really just in like, this is what color I think this could be. This is a lighting ratio. This is the visual texture, but it was fairly specific because there are only so many looks in the film. So it's just like, this is this and this is this, just pointing at different aspects of the image. And whereas the actual approach was a lot more multifaceted and expansive in what we were looking at.
This is fun going down memory lane because as we're reminiscing, like I remember Lay Me by the Shore, a short film by David Finley, was very moving. And what was really valuable to me was on Vimeo, he actually recorded a live director's commentary to that short film and talked about how he wanted the camera to feel like the ghost of the friend who passed away in that. And I think you really did a great job of capturing that. That's another thing. I really wanted the camera to feel like an ethereal presence that is at many times Nabil's point of view, but at many times it's, third person omniscient, and it's experiencing grief and questioning kind of from Kareem, the brother's point of view, kind of wondering and hoping that his brother will do good by him and vice versa. So yeah, that was another short film that I remember being really touched by and moved by and informing that perspective. Two other things that people have complimented in the cinematography are the water scenes. And I think there I'd love to talk about prep and location scouting, and especially with children who are ACTRA. There was a lot of prep that went into making sure we could execute not just on the day, but almost to the minute.
Yeah, the water sequence needed to be mapped out pretty specifically because there were a few different layers that were driving it. One of them was the sun, as it always is often is for most film, particularly exteriors. We wanted to shoot it when the sun was in a certain place. Kind of bigger was just the logistics of shooting a water rescue with kids, because the kids they can only be on set for so long. So there's tight time windows before they have to take a break.
And it was cold.
Yeah,
it was end of September. The water was cold.
Yeah, so there's the ACTRA time restriction. They can only be shooting for so long. But more pressingly, there was the water restriction, because like once the kid's in the water, you don't want to take him out again and warm him up and put him in. That's very time consuming, but you can also only leave him in there for so long. So we needed to shoot the whole sequence so that we were essentially shooting it once, top to bottom, stopping and starting with it wasn't necessarily shot chronologically because, or was it the one kid being wet and dry required him being shot in a certain order, because there's coverage with him dry on the shore and then in the water and then wet on the shore. And so we needed to have the way we were going to shoot it fairly rehearsed, which involved going in with an iPhone, shooting it with Gavin and I in advance, just figuring out what kind of angles we wanted so that I could essentially because there's a limit to how much you can. I mean, we're doing a lot of stuff with the camera once we were in the water, moving pretty freely, but that's because we'd established this. We knew what shots we were looking for. Within that, I could just sort of work with how the camera was angled and where I was relative to the cast. There was also the added thing that the camera's in a splash bag and the remote focus couldn't reach the shore, so the AC had to be in like a little dinghy towed along behind me. Which means that I was moving pretty freely, but we had to track a little boat moving behind me as well. This was all in, I think it was like chest deep maximum, so you could walk around in the water however slowly. But we really needed to make sure that everywhere the camera was going to point, there weren't any people in the shot. There wasn't an AC in a dinghy. Where were you? I forget. Were you in the dinghy or were you on land?
I think I was definitely in the water, because for me, it was important for both the safety of the kids and even more so for I felt like it would be, sorry, I'm trying not to use a bad word here, but I didn't think it would be cool to put the kids in this like end of September, early October, cold water in Quebec and not be in there with them. I felt like I would lose them. I felt like it would be a SHI thing to do for the crew too, like to just be in a director's chair on the dry, warm shore while like putting you and the rest of the team through that. Like I felt like it had to be, I guess trying not to be braggadocious, but I felt like as a creative leader, it was important for me to be in the soup with you guys. And so I think I was like walking around behind you and giving direction to the kid, like yell your brother's name. And I was asking you to do a couple things on the fly. And also kudos, as you're saying, to Jen Van for finding that location, which we were able to get far enough from the shore that we could create a sense of danger, but it was actually quite shallow. So the kid was never actually at risk of drowning. And so we were able to achieve this sense of danger in a relatively safe way. We had obviously stunt supervisors who were water experts in the water too, warming up the kids. I remember that.
Yeah, having you in the water was definitely just the most logical thing from a communication standpoint.
Yeah.
Because, it just puts you where you need to be to see what's happening and guide it. That was the right call.
And sometimes there were things like when the camera was underwater, I think that also blocked the RF frequency that could get to the focus puller. So there was,
That's right.
It was like physical choreography in terms of where we were walking to get the frames clean without crew and stuff like that, without the dinghy, without me. But then there is live choreography like between us or between me and the actors or the sound person to on the fly improvise with the AC saying like, I can't pull focus at that depth or something. And then we're reframing accordingly. And it's fun.
Yeah.
That's the game. Okay. The particle shots, a lot of people have really complimented those, especially in theaters. Like they really, really play and they give such a sensorial, ethereal vibe. I know we watched a lot of the Criterion Collection behind the scenes on Terrence Malick DVDs or Blu-rays to figure out how to shoot particles in that sort of way. Can you break that down? What do you remember from that?
Why don't you start by reminding us what the particles represent?
Cool. Yeah, actually, great question. So there's a recurring monologue where the brother Kareem, who's struggling with his mental health, expresses the complicated emotional state he's in through this analogy of it takes X number of tons of sand to make one pane of glass. That sand gets melted down at 3,200 degrees and ultimately goes from something incredibly hard to something incredibly fragile. And I want to represent that analogy from his cryptic dialogue that then comes back in the epilogue. And so ultimately the visuals were a representation of sand turning to glass as a metaphor for the grief of how the disease has affected his brother. And so the brief to you was, how do we capture the particles between sand and glass transforming as a visual leitmotif between the two, again, I'll use timelines, but really like emotional states.
Yeah, there's an element of transcendence there too, right? Like of kind of transferring between spiritual planes or from the past and the present. So it's kind of used to bridge in those ways as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I recall that we tied it into the reality, so it ties into the content of the film when you see Karim on the beach dropping sand in front of his eyes. The idea is that he's having this thought in the first place.
Rumination. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's that's the closest to a literal representation of the concepts. And we wanted to shoot that in a way that we were drawn from the sand as pure texture into reality. That was shot fairly simply with a macro lens that compressed it and brings the sand into the foreground, then brings us into his reality. And then we then took that image and abstracted it in different ways. One is at the end of the film, as it was originally shot, things commuted in post. I don't know if it made it into the final. It was Karim walks into the
Yeah.
water
That's in the
at
YouTube
sunset.
version.
Oh, it is. Okay. Yeah, I knew
It's
there
in
were a
the
few.
CBC. Yeah, it's in the CBC Gem version, and
Yeah.
it's in the YouTube version. Those are essentially the director's cuts that have
Okay,
the
good.
like almost pseudo afterlife thing.
Yeah, yeah. So that was, I guess, a visual depiction of his transcendence or acceptance
Yes.
in a way. And so we wanted to situate the sand texture within that, which was shot at sunset magic hour. And so one of our discussions was like, okay, can we shoot this abstract sand within that magic hour window and squeeze to make that happen? And I guess I'm getting ahead. The way that we ended up shooting it, I often like playing with different ways to shoot abstract textures. We looked at the stuff in there's some great stuff in Tree of Life. Some of it is shooting dye and
Yeah.
oil mixture. Some of it is a little more mysterious. Chivo has done some really fantastic stuff with textures that I think is a little secret, but we looked at those as a guidepost. I've captured abstract material in the past without a lens on the camera so that the sensor can capture refractions directly, which you can create in different ways through reflecting off of different physical mediums. But that was too abstract for this. We wanted to feel the texture of the sands more literally. And so we ended up suspending reflective materials that resembled sand so they would catch in the right way within glass jars and spinning it and agitating it with a macro lens, shooting through it so that you could place it onto different backgrounds. One of the first ways we shot this was sort of a test with the idea that it could also be used as a luma plate, because if you shoot on black, sometimes you can use that to extract it. We just shot it in studio to try some of the techniques, and that did end up in the film to sort of juxtapose against the stuff that we did later end up shooting on the beach. We weren't totally sure if we'd be able to squeeze it in, and it was also sort of a backup, like, okay, well, at least we'll have this, and worst case, we can luma plate it if we just run out of time because we're trying to cram this stuff in the sunset magic hour. We did end up doing both. But yeah, that's how we shot the abstract textures on this one.
I feel like increasingly what I've really learned over short films is like the things that are often the first to get cut from a day are often actually the things you really have to fight for, because that's the difference between just getting coverage and ending up with with not so great, like a crappy TV show that is in theaters, and then it doesn't get into festivals or whatever. And it's like that's what makes it so personal. Like that stuff is what makes it so specific and unique and artistic. And it's always
Yeah.
like, do we really need the shots of the, like, are we really going to sacrifice time while the sun is setting at magic hours to get these particles in various vases? Because I think you'd rigged, like, we tested different vases filled with different fluids that we tested with different types of particles so that we could get different levels of buoyancy so that we could capture those particles with a macro lens, which is kind of tricky. And then with the sun setting, and those are the first things that everyone's always like, why are we wasting our time with this when we have actors that we have to get, you know? And it's like, but that's what I think really sells the feeling of what it feels like to be in this situation beyond just watching dialogue.
Yeah. And that's the strength of independent film is you may not have all the resources, but you can choose how you want to weight your decisions and your priorities. There are certain shows, a lot of TV where that's exactly it. It's like you have to do these things in order to responsibly cover your scenes, and then there's the wish list, and that has to be at the bottom. But in independent cinema, the wish list can be the whole film. You're not encumbered to beyond your own way that you want to tell the story to cover or shoot in any particular way, and that's what gives it its personality.
Yeah. Moving on to tools, can you talk a little bit about Artemis, maybe Shot Designer, Shot Deck, like some of those tools that you use to put all this stuff we're talking about and that's in our head and like projecting onto the back of our foreheads into more easily digestible and communicable blueprints to execute?
Yeah, there's a bunch of apps that make communication and planning easy. Or Artemis is a viewfinder app, and it basically, you punch in your camera and your focal lengths, and it lets you fairly accurately line up a given shot. And I always use that on set and in prep, just as like before you take the time to line up a shot, just to show the director, like, do we want to do this? Because it's very easy to just try stuff, switch focal lengths, talk about what you do like and don't like, just as a visual length. Like some directors will go in and actually take their own specific shots. Some people don't think in that way. And so it's just a useful tool to just show people things before you go about doing them. So that's very handy. And then there's other apps for planning the sun position for day exteriors. Sunseeker is one. You can be in a place or have a map view and just tell it when you're going to be there, because often you're scouting a few months in advance and the sun will be in a different place, so it can compensate with sun position. And then another one I'll use is called Helios, which is made by the same people who make Artemis, and that's got a neat 3D simulated building feature that I quite like. It's less useful for natural environments like forests, because it's not super accurate or doesn't necessarily have the foliage simulated. But if you're shooting in urban environments, it's got pretty good data on the height and geometry of buildings, and you can use it to pretty accurately determine where shadows are going to be cast at a given time, which can actually be really important if you're shooting in like an alleyway in a downtown, and you want to know, like, when do we need to be here to be in light or not in light? And so that's a handy little simulator. And then, yeah, another one is Shot Designer. Did we use Shot Designer much on this?
Yeah, we used Shot Designer when you came to Montreal to do the planning, and we were breaking down the script and building the shot list, and we were trying to make sure we were on the same page.
Yeah, it's Shot Designer is a fairly simple app for making camera and lighting plots primarily. You can build a simple overhead view of a set by drawing lines and adding doorways and using pre-made icons and position cameras and little circles with noses that represent people.
Yeah.
So you can work
and squares with triangles
with
for cameras.
Yeah, and say camera starts here and moves here, and when you need it, it can be useful for really any scene that requires a bit more in-depth breaking down. Like an example that didn't come up on this, but it's like if you got a dinner table scene with potentially a lot of coverage, you can use it to just track how many angles you actually need. And for scenes with a lot of setups, it can be a useful way to just map things out before taking the time on the day. But it can also just be a quick way to just talk about ideas and track a relatively simple scene as you're discussing it with the director without anything physically in front of you. So like I've used it before in a set that isn't necessarily built yet. Like I'm working with the director with a script before the production designer has roughed anything in yet, sometimes happens. We can just rough in simple geometry for a set. It's like, oh, this person needs to see this from here. This entrance needs to be here, just so that we can come up with a shooting approach that can suggest some parameters for the geometry of a space so that we can bring that to the production designer and say like, hey, here's kind of the layout of what we were thinking. And then they can refine that further. So it can be useful for just anywhere you want to just keep track of shots on a screen.
Yeah, it's funny how quickly not only can things get out of hand and money can get wasted, but even just a simple sketch can solve so many problems. I always have my clipboard with a pen and paper. I think you had like an iPad mini in like a holster that you sewed yourself or something.
Yeah, I use that. Yeah, I use an iPad mini on set because it's small and you can fit it in a pocket. And when I don't have a pocket that's big enough, I have made like a pouch with a strap just so I can kind of always have it.
And you inspired me from that. You can build shortcuts on an iPad. You can click the shortcut and it'll open the call sheet immediately. But I remember even with the iPad mini, you'd like pull it out and have the call sheet right there. And that was really handy. Like these little
use
things.
Scriptation to compile all my PDFs. Usually I'll have like the scripts and the call sheet and often like the overall shoot schedule. And when I'm on a longer form thing, just while I'm having breakfast, I'll just kind of go through and update the PDFs that I need at hand on a given day. And then I use other apps like Google Suite, and I've been using GoodNotes just to track my overall notes. So yeah, it's a handy way to just have everything you need in one place.
I think one of the best story decisions came from you in that shot of Kareem on the beach. Originally, he was talking about that kind of complicated monologue that I had included because conceptually, you know, when we have the eulogy, it was a callback and it all tracked together. Like it all made sense in my mind. But then on the day we did like 8 takes and it just wasn't working. And I remember you turning to me and saying, what if he says, hey, Kareem, and instead of saying the monologue, we just hold for a beat. And then he says, never mind, which was the last word of the previously very long monologue. And that was the take that made it into the film. And I guess like what I can take credit for is I do think the actor got to kind of charge up and load that beat with everything he wanted to say, but had to hold back. But I 100% give you credit for having had that insight to propose that take. Do you remember either that moment or just in general, like how do you pitch ideas while the clock is ticking and things are going wrong and you know the director's not getting what he wants? It's so delicate, right? And essentially like potentially the director being embarrassed or having to put the ego at the forefront so they don't lose the crew with like everyone suggesting ideas when they think the director's wrong. Like it's so delicate, but I'm so grateful that you offered that to me.
Yeah, that was a challenging one because it was like a particular section of dialogue that mirrored something that happened later, but it's just it can be hard for any actor, let alone a young actor, to execute. And from what I remember, I think it could have been just watching him and seeing the moment when he was about to say it, and that bit of processing, feeling very real, because it's real mental processing without the burden of needing to convincingly deliver lines. And so just noticing that maybe the scene works if you just distill it to that thing that's withheld, that's then realized or delivered to the audience later through his letter. And when you're on set, offering suggestions just should be done delicately, because you can get into situations where, not often, I think on most professional sets, people have like a good amount of discretion as to when they should jump in. But you can run into a thing where it's a free for all and too many voices enter the equation, and it can just become difficult to stick to a direction. But I always like to just position myself so that I'm in regular dialogue with the director, and it's quietly to the director. And if I have any ideas to propose, I'll just, not to the group, just to them, say like, hey, what about this? And I do that pretty frequently so that they can be comfortable saying yes or no, or taking the time to think. And then sometimes they can take and run with it if they want, or other times when we've gotten on the same page, like I can help explain to people if that's easier, because it's a more technical thing. But yeah, just having that sort of like quiet running dialogue with the director and being their point person, just someone to bounce ideas off of quietly.
Yeah, in the color sessions, I remember we only technically had one day due to budget, but I think Outpost generously gave us way more than we had budget for, kindly. I remember giving the colorist like some lengthy monologue about what something represented, and I think you said something like highs up, mids down. So, and we were talking about it, like sometimes your role is as a translator, and I think the way you described it is like the director's speaking in Japanese, and then you're like the subtitle.
Yeah, I mean that role of a translator is a big part of the DP's thing, because I mean the director is always dealing with the emotional intent, and then that has to be created through a lot of different technicians. And like some technicians you can give that sort of direction to, like a really good camera operator in a certain circumstance with the right amount of trust, like a director can talk in that way emotionally. It's not like crew members can't access that, but a lot of the time the DP's job is to turn an emotional intent into like boom a little slower, or make the light warmer, or turn that one off. So and most of the technicians on set just you need to deliver information more literally. So yeah, it's that conduit process.
I mean, now that you are an experienced professional cinematographer, do you have any? We'll start with words of advice that you would give to yourself, let's say 10 years ago. Let's say now, where you are now, remember where you were when you shot Case Closed. What would you tell that Justin?
General advice. I don't know. It's tricky. One I've heard recently that is sort of a cop-out, but feels true, is that the utility of advice is limited, because you have to sort of make mistakes in order to truly learn from them and realize like how you interpret the situation. And so that would be an easy cop-out to avoid.
Yeah, text, context, subtext, but just give us some text.
Yeah, let's see.
Or, okay, I can rephrase it also as literally a mistake you made that you learned from, that others might be able to just observe through you recounting.
Yeah, I guess if I think about if I try to remember how I operated when we shot Case Closed, which was like 10 or 12 or something years ago, one little thing I've learned over time is just specificity of communication. And that's something I'm regularly tracking, but just knowing, like, yeah, it's kind of like we were just discussing, like the conversation one might have with a certain director who thinks in a certain way can be pretty loose and emotional and casual. And then the communication you might have with an on-set technician should usually be quite specific. And so I think in my regular discourse, I've just tried to tighten up how specific I am when talking to people. But even there too is a balance, in that the more skilled even a technician is, often you want to limit how prescriptive you should be when talking to them. Like sometimes it is just a matter of clarity and just as clearly as possible tell the person to do the thing more slowly, faster, whatever. But if you're super literal and prescriptive all the time, then even the technicians that you work with can feel like they're not able to fully use their skill and discretion and express themselves. Even within those roles, like say if you're talking to a camera op or a gaffer or a key grip, there are a lot of times when it's appropriate to give more results oriented direction than telling them exactly what to do, so that they have room to contribute as well. So that's something I'm always tuning, is how prescriptive or evocative to be in any communication in any context.
Yeah. Awesome. I agree. Like in the sense that you have to try things and then you're like, oh, that worked within this context, or that didn't work within this context. But that's not to say that that's not a tool that you should throw out of your toolbox. You might just now have more experience and you're like, okay, that didn't work that time. But you have to learn these things. And sometimes, yeah, when people ask for advice and you tell them, don't do this, it's like, well, maybe you should do that in this other situation.
Yeah. And also like it's the way that people conduct themselves, light, socialize, run their business, whatever, are also personal and also different. So what works for me might not work for you.
Yeah, which I think, every film you are developing a language for the film. and you're developing communication styles and languages with each other. And like, I remember, by day 3 on this, we were like, let's put the 75 or like, let's put the 50, or we got more precise with our language that came from just developing a sense for which lens was the right tool. Because by day 3 of 4, being three of 3.5 or whatever it was, it's like we figured out which lenses mean what. Also because they have to, like, we have a perspective and now we know what's coherent with that perspective as it builds.
And that sort of visual language is director specific and project specific. And so it's like, yeah, you can learn certain guideposts, but really it's with each process, with each project, it's a matter of just kind of dialing your sensibility for that thing until, yeah, you realize how a certain director or film wants to frame a close-up, how far the camera should be.
And is there any advice that you've been given or mentorship that you've found particularly valuable that you could share?
People in film, where I live in Toronto, are very generous with their time. And so when I've reached out to people, they're usually very receptive. When I have questions, they'll answer them. The industry as a whole is very inclusive. And so I've benefited from being able to ask knowledgeable people specific questions all the time, and I still do. Conversely, requests for like general advice are often tricky because I don't know, people often run into the same issue I have with giving it. It's all very circumstance dependent, but you learn a lot just from watching good people work. Directors, crew members, just being around skilled people and watching how they conduct themselves and how they have their approach organized is the best way that I've found to learn. I've learned from everybody I'm around, from directors I'm working with to producers I'm working with to the technicians I work with. And as you work with better and better crews, you're just able to absorb that experience through watching how they are.
Yeah, well, I appreciated your shout out to the production designer and Nick Marion earlier, because also I don't think production designers get enough credit. I mean, like, you and Nick work so well together. So there's a relationship there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the physical objects on screen obviously have a huge impact on the way the film looks, what color they are, how cohesive it is, how that coheres with the lighting. But then even on a more technical kind of DP level, the way that spaces are chosen or designed for light is really critical. If you're building a set, how windows are placed and how backdrops are selected, there's a whole realm of how a space is designed to accommodate photography, accommodate lighting, that the DP and production designer will interact with. They're very correlated. But yeah, the sensibilities of a production designer for how to design light into a space through practicals, through depth, through windows is massive, because you can't make you can only do so much with a given space. You can't light your way out of a tiny box for like a flat wall being a flat wall,
Yeah, I mean, when you say practicals, you're talking about like a lamp, for example, that might be both production design, but also serve a technical purpose. You could change the bulb, right? But you want to have that conversation with the production designer before you actually show up on the day and we're burning money. I remember on this, you and Nick worked very closely in the hospital where we had these like floating glass walls, working to ensure that she like frosted or prepped the glass at a height so that your camera could shoot without the camera's reflection being in the glass. That one stands out. And then with a lot of the epilogue stuff at the cottage, there was how she, for example, she cleaned a TV, and this was very much a shot that I took from After Sun. It just meant so much to me because it's just a TV with a curtain waving. And there was actually a lot of thought that went into, like, she cleaned the TV and then she applied fake dirt to the TV. And then we wrangled like the window, and I think someone was like flagging air to get the curtain waving. So it felt like a presence was in the space. It looks and feels like the camera was just set up and shot a TV. Or in the space where the two brothers are in the bedroom, figuring out what size particles to blow into the air so that there was like a atmosphere in the space. And there was like some glitter too. We have a shot that I'll throw to while we're talking here of like a race car on the side of a bed that's supposed to feel like revisiting a memory. And I remember us testing different types of glitter to feel the way we wanted to feel.
Yeah, to get the dust motes to read on camera. Yeah.
Yeah. So some fun stuff there. Well, those are all my questions for today, Justin. Anything you want to add as from anything that's come up through memory lane?
Not immediately.
All right. Thanks for taking the time to chat with me. Always a pleasure. This was really fun. I appreciate all the work you did on this. And a lot of people have been really touched by it, especially on the festival circuit. I've talked to people in Edmonton and Seattle who have lost people or been touched by mental health issues, mental illness, medically assisted dying. You know, cinema is an expensive artistic craft. So it's always hard to gauge the impact, but I know we've, touched some people, and yeah, thanks for coming along for the ride.
Yeah. Thank you. It was fun to relive all of the decisions that the little ones made along the way that are just woven into the thing, and it's like, oh yeah, we really did think about that dust, didn't we?
Yeah,
It's fun reliving it.